The excavator bucket bit into the red clay beneath a gazebo that had barely finished drying in the North Carolina sun. I am Owen Mercer, and 3 weeks earlier, the Hawthorne Glen HOA had filled the drainage ditch along my property to build that pavilion, insisting they were improving an eyesore. Now engineers were measuring the same ground while HOA President Trish Caldwell watched every bucketful come back out. If your neighbor buried a working drainage channel for a community project, what would you do? What nobody understood that first morning was how an ordinary-looking ditch could turn one gazebo into a regulatory nightmare. It started with the sound of a dump truck at 6:40 in the morning. The noise came from the eastern edge of my 7-acre property, where Hawthorne Glen's common land met the drainage corridor. I had planned to spend that morning checking survey stakes before a fence contractor arrived, but when I reached the boundary, a skid steer was pushing red clay into the open ditch. Water was still moving through the bottom. A worker guided an 18-inch corrugated pipe into place, while another machine packed soil over it. I pulled out my phone and recorded the upstream culvert, the flowing water, and the fresh fill before approaching the foreman. "Where is your bypass calculation?" I asked. He lowered his clipboard. "We are piping the ditch." "I can see that. What design flow are you carrying?" His expression told me he had not expected that question. Before he answered, Trish Caldwell walked over carrying rolled plans beneath one arm. I knew Trish as Hawthorne Glen's HOA president, and until that morning, we had been civil neighbors. She smiled like she expected me to appreciate what I was seeing. "Owen, you finally caught us on construction day." She pointed toward stakes marking a broad platform. "That is the Hawthorne Pavilion. Accessible walkway, landscaping, seating. Residents have wanted this for years. You are building it over the drainage path. We are improving the drainage path." She unrolled the contractor drawing across the hood of a utility cart. The ditch would disappear beneath fill, the pipe would carry water underneath, and the gazebo would sit above the newly graded area. I compared the drawing with the culvert feeding the ditch. "That upstream opening is larger than 18 inches. Our contractor selected the pipe. Where is the drainage engineer's stamp?" Trish's smile faded. She pointed to the contractor's name instead. "The board approved the project. We have insurance, a signed contract, and permission to improve the common area. Part of this corridor runs along my property. The HOA has a drainage easement." That stopped me. I knew an easement existed, but I had never needed to study its exact language because the ditch had always done what it was supposed to do. I asked the foreman to pause fill placement while we verified the documents. Trish shook her head. "We have concrete scheduled Friday. Delaying crews costs homeowners money." Behind her, the skid steer pushed another load forward. Muddy water vanished beneath the clay. I photographed it, then stepped toward an orange survey pin I remembered from my closing documents. It was still visible beside the fresh grade, less than 20 feet from the planned gazebo footing. I crouched, photographed the pin against the fill, and checked the rolled plan again. The pavilion layout appeared to cross farther toward my side than Trish realized. Then I noticed something even stranger. The contractor drawing showed the ditch, the new pipe, and the gazebo, but nowhere on the page was there a property boundary. I went home and pulled the recorded plat and deed from the folder I had received at closing. The easement was real, which meant I could not simply order Hawthorne Glen off every foot of the corridor. Its language allowed stormwater conveyance and reasonable access for inspection, maintenance, repair, and replacement of drainage facilities. Nothing I read said recreational construction, but I knew better than to build an argument around one sentence before understanding the system. So I started with what I could measure. The upstream culvert was 30 inches wide. The new pipe beneath the fill was 18 inches. I checked slope, photographed inlet and outlet elevations, estimated the contributing drainage area, then ran a basic capacity comparison. The numbers were uncomfortable enough that I emailed Trish before noon. I explained that restricting an open channel into that pipe could increase upstream water levels during heavier storms, and I asked her to suspend work until whoever designed it provided drainage calculations. Her reply came 40 minutes later. "Thank you for your concerns. Our contractor has confirmed the installation is appropriate." By dinner, my email had been forwarded to Hawthorne Glen residents with a message from Trish saying the board was reviewing technical concerns raised by an adjacent landowner but remained confident in its contractor. She had not misquoted me. That made it more effective. To the neighborhood, this now looked like two competing opinions. The next morning, framing lumber arrived. I drove to the boundary and found Trish checking deliveries. "Did your contractor provide calculations?" I asked. "He says the pipe is standard for this application." "That is not a calculation." Her expression tightened. "Owen, people voted for this project. We spent months fundraising and approving the budget. I cannot stop construction every time someone disagrees with a design choice. I am not asking because I dislike your gazebo. Then give us something more than your opinion." She had a point, and I hated that she did. I had treated the hydraulic concern as if my profession automatically settled the argument. It did not settle the property question either. That afternoon, I hired a licensed surveyor to locate the boundary and easement on the ground. Before he could schedule the field work, I returned to photograph the orange survey pin beside the fresh grade one more time. It was gone. I searched the disturbed soil and found no marker, only tire tracks. I still had the time-stamped photograph from construction morning, so I backed it up with the rest of my records. Then Trish emailed me a formal notice from the HOA board instructing me not to interfere with contractors working inside the drainage easement. Attached was a revised site plan I had never seen before. This version finally showed a property line, and according to that line, the entire gazebo sat on Hawthorne Glen land. The orange pin from my photograph was almost 6 feet away from where their new drawing said the boundary should be. The surveyor could not get there until Thursday, and the weather moved faster. Tuesday night brought just under an inch of rain. At sunrise, I walked the corridor expecting the 18-inch pipe to prove my calculations right. Instead, water was moving through it without backing into Hawthorne Glen. The lawn upstream was wet, but not flooded. I stood there staring at the inlet longer than I want to admit. Trish arrived while I was measuring the water line. "Is it failing?" she asked. "Not in this storm." She waited. "So the contractor may have been right? For this amount of rain, the pipe is carrying it." Saying that cost me nothing legally, but it changed the conversation. Trish nodded once. "I appreciate you saying it." Then she walked toward the gazebo framing, and for about 30 seconds I wondered whether I had turned a legitimate boundary concern into a technical fight I could not prove. That changed when I followed the outlet downstream. The water coming from beneath the new fill looked like chocolate milk. Fine red sediment was moving across my property into a shallow strip of rushes and wet grass I had always treated as seasonal ground. I took samples only for documentation, photographed the plume, then followed the flow farther than I ever had before. The shallow swale did not fade into the woods. It curved southeast, widened, and continued toward a wet channel beyond my back fence. I pulled up photographs from the previous spring. The same vegetation corridor was visible, green even during a dry week. My first assumption had been too narrow. I had been arguing about whether an 18-inch pipe could replace an open ditch. I had never asked what the ditch connected to. I called an environmental consultant I had worked with on private development projects and described only what I could verify: active drainage, recent fill, downstream wet vegetation, and sediment leaving the disturbed area. "Do not call it a wetland yet," she said. "Do not call it jurisdictional anything until somebody evaluates it." But I would document the pre-construction condition immediately. That was exactly the kind of answer I trusted. No dramatic conclusion, just a different question. An hour later, Trish called me. Her tone was controlled but sharper than before. "I heard you were walking beyond the easement taking pictures. On my property. Are you trying to turn this into an environmental complaint now?" "I am trying to understand where the water goes." "Owen, this is a man-made drainage ditch." "Maybe. That does not tell us what it connects to." She went quiet. Then she said something I had not expected. "The board was told environmental review was not required." I stopped walking. "Told by whom?" "It is in the project packet." She ended the call before explaining further. That afternoon, my surveyor moved my appointment up after another job canceled. He found the original control points and re-established the missing corner. The orange pin in my photograph had been right. Fresh fill crossed onto my parcel, and part of the planned gazebo footprint crossed with it. But while he was flagging the easement, he pointed downstream toward the wet corridor and said, "Owen, before you make this only about 6 feet of property, you may want to find the original subdivision drainage plan." The original subdivision plan was not in my closing file, so I requested it through the County Development Records Office and sent my survey to Trish before doing anything else. I expected an argument. Instead, she drove over that afternoon and stood beside the new boundary flags for nearly a minute. "That is not where our drawing put the line," she said. "I know. How far are we over?" "The fill varies. The gazebo footprint crosses by several feet at the closest point." She rubbed her forehead, then surprised me. "Give me until tomorrow." The next morning she returned without the board. Her proposal was practical. Shift the pavilion completely onto HOA property. Replace the 18-inch pipe with a 24-inch pipe. Excavate the fill that crossed my boundary. Restore my ground. And have Hawthorne Glen pay for everything. 2 days earlier, I would have accepted. Then she handed me the release. I read past the property restoration language to the final paragraph. It waived all existing and future claims arising from alteration of the drainage corridor. "I cannot sign this." Her face hardened. "You wanted your property restored." "I still do." "Then what changed?" "The water does not stop at my property." Trish stared at me. "So now this is environmental?" "I do not know yet. That is why I cannot release it." She gathered the papers slowly. "Every day this project sits costs our homeowners money. We have deposits, landscaping scheduled, and a dedication date. I am offering to correct the encroachment. Then correct it without asking me to certify something neither of us has established." She left angry, and I understood why. From her side, I had moved from pipe capacity to property lines to downstream conditions. From mine, each answer had exposed a larger question. That afternoon, my environmental consultant walked the corridor with me. She examined the active channel, wet vegetation, soil changes, the new pipe outlet, and the sediment path. She refused to give me the conclusion I wanted on the spot. "I need the original development documents and a broader site review," she said. "Until then, do not represent this as a federal wetland issue." What should I tell the HOA? Tell them exactly what you know. There is an unresolved drainage and environmental question. Nothing more. I did. Trish replied that the board would pause additional fill placement, but continue work it believed was outside the disputed area. That was not the shutdown I wanted, but it was movement. Then the county emailed the archived subdivision plan. I opened the file expecting drainage dimensions. Instead, I found the corridor shaded continuously from Hawthorne Glen, across the edge of my parcel, and toward the downstream wet channel. Beside it was a notation referencing environmental and stormwater conditions attached to the original development approval. The ditch the HOA had called an eyesore had been drawn into the subdivision's approved drainage system before the first house was ever sold. I sent the archived plan, the new survey, and my consultant's preliminary field notes to the county office that had issued the subdivision approvals. I did not accuse Hawthorne Glen of violating environmental law. I asked whether the pavilion work was consistent with the approved drainage conditions and whether the altered corridor required additional review. 2 days later, a county inspector visited the site. By lunch, an orange stop work notice was attached to the construction fence. No more grading. No additional fill. No concrete work in the disputed area until the drainage and boundary questions were resolved. Trish called me that afternoon. "You got what you wanted. I wanted the ditch restored. The project is stopped, Owen." "That is not the same thing." She hung up. Still, for the first time since the dump trucks arrived, nothing moved at the boundary. The excavator sat idle. The gazebo framing remained unfinished. Trish also confirmed in writing that the board would shift the structure entirely off my parcel once work resumed. I thought we had finally reduced the dispute to something manageable. Then Mark Ellis knocked on my door. I knew him as Hawthorne Glen's treasurer, but we had never spoken beyond waving across the road. He carried a binder and looked uncomfortable. "I am not here against Trish," he said immediately. "I signed these checks too." He showed me the pavilion budget. Nearly $90,000 had already been committed among site work, materials, landscaping, accessibility improvements, and deposits. If this dies completely, homeowners are going to ask how we approved it. They should. That is why I am here. Mark opened the original board project packet. The environmental section contained one line: "Review not required. Existing upland landscaped area." I looked at him. Who wrote that? It came with the contractor proposal. Mark turned several pages and showed me a photograph used during the board presentation. It had been taken years earlier at a subdivision event. The ditch was visible behind a temporary construction crossing. Beyond it, the same wet corridor I had followed after the storm continued toward the downstream channel. "I thought this helped us," Mark said. "It shows the ditch was man-made." I barely heard him. The photograph included grading stakes and a section of exposed channel that matched the corridor shown on the archived development plan. I sent the image to my environmental consultant while Mark was still sitting at my kitchen table. She called 12 minutes later. "Owen, I need to compare this with the approval conditions and inspect farther downstream. But do not let anyone tell you moving the gazebo 6 feet solves this." "Why?" "Because the structure may be the least important thing they changed." The next morning, she completed the broader field review. Her message arrived before 8. The fill itself, not merely the encroachment, now required regulatory scrutiny. I had spent a week trying to get Hawthorne Glen to move a gazebo. Now I was being told that even if they moved it tomorrow, the dirt underneath might still have to come back out. My consultant met with Trish, Mark, and me at the stopped work site the next afternoon. She laid the archived development plan beside photographs of the corridor before construction and traced the drainage path downstream with one finger. "The important question is not whether somebody dug portions of this ditch years ago," she said. "The question is what regulatory conditions apply to this connected feature and what authorization was required before placing fill." Trish crossed her arms. "Our contractor called it ordinary drainage. Your contractor can describe his scope. He cannot make the regulatory determination for the agencies involved." She explained that the historical approvals, persistent wet conditions, downstream connection, and actual placement of fill were enough to require formal review rather than assumptions from a landscape proposal. If the affected feature fell within applicable federal jurisdiction, the United States Army Corps of Engineers would normally handle Clean Water Act Section 404 permitting questions, with the Environmental Protection Agency retaining enforcement authority under the Act. State and local stormwater requirements could apply separately. That distinction mattered. I had been thinking about a ditch as infrastructure. Trish had been thinking about it as landscaping. The law could treat the act of putting dirt into it as something neither of us had evaluated before construction began. "So we moved the gazebo and install a larger pipe," Trish said. My consultant shook her head. "That may address hydraulics. It does not erase fill already placed without whatever authorization was required." Trish looked at Mark. His face changed before hers did. "How expensive?" he asked. "Nobody responsible should give you a number before the review." That was when the cheap solution disappeared. Trish hired her own environmental consultant and counsel within 48 hours. They did not concede anything. Their position was that the corridor had been historically altered, functioned as man-made drainage, and that the HOA had relied on professional contractors in good faith. Then Trish produced photographs of me using a compact excavator in the ditch 2 summers earlier. "You excavated it yourself?" she said during our next meeting. For a moment, I had no clean answer ready. The photograph looked terrible without context. I went home and pulled my old maintenance records. They showed I had removed a fallen limb, accumulated sediment, and debris while preserving the existing channel grade and flow path. I had photographs from afterwards showing the ditch still open. That setback taught me something my calculations had not. Every claim needed a timeline an outsider could understand. I reorganized everything chronologically, from the pre-construction video and missing survey pin to the revised boundary drawing, storm sediment, archive plan, contractor packet, and current fill limits. Then Mark called. "Trish says council believes the stop work order only prevents grading," he said. "The pavilion framing is outside the restricted work." I looked toward Hawthorne Glen. Workers were already unloading roofing material. They are finishing it. Founders' picnic is Saturday. The HOA was about to cut a ribbon over ground that regulators had not finished deciding they were allowed to fill. Saturday morning, the pavilion looked finished enough for photographs. Fresh cedar posts supported the roof, folding chairs lined the accessible walkway, and a blue Hawthorne Glen ribbon stretched between 2 temporary stands. I stayed on my side of the boundary. 2 weeks earlier, I would have walked over with calculations and tried to convince everyone the project was wrong. I had learned better. My job now was not to win an argument at a picnic. It was to preserve a record that could survive one. Before residents arrived, I photographed the restored survey flags, the gazebo location, the pipe inlet, and the downstream corridor from established points I had already documented. I backed up the original construction video showing water beneath the fill, the time-stamped photograph of the missing orange survey pin, the revised site plan with the incorrect boundary, the survey, the storm photographs, the archived subdivision plan, Mark's project packet, and my maintenance records showing what I had actually done 2 summers earlier. Then I assembled them chronologically with my consultant's field findings. Trish saw me across the corridor and walked over. She looked exhausted, but composed. "You are not planning to interrupt this, are you?" "No," she seemed surprised. "Thank you. That does not mean the drainage issue is finished." "I know." For once, neither of us argued. She went back to residents who had spent months waiting for the pavilion. Watching her greet families made the conflict harder, not easier. She had built something people genuinely wanted. That did not change what was underneath it. A brief rain shower arrived after lunch. People moved beneath the gazebo roof and laughed while Trish cut the ribbon. I walked downstream instead. The pipe was carrying water, just as it had during the earlier storm. Then I reached the wet corridor. A reddish plume was spreading through the shallow channel again. I recorded continuously from the pipe outlet to the downstream connection, keeping landmarks visible so nobody could later claim the images came from somewhere else. That evening, I added the footage to the factual package and submitted it through the regulatory review process already underway, along with the construction sequence showing that the pavilion had been completed after the county stopped additional grading. I did not ask anyone to punish Hawthorne Glen. I asked one question: what restoration, permitting, or enforcement response was required for the fill already placed? Mark called Sunday night. "Trish's consultant still believes they can defend this as altered drainage," he said. "And if they cannot?" He paused. "I started pricing excavation because I am the treasurer. Just mobilizing equipment around that pavilion could be ugly." Monday afternoon, Trish received the same notice I did. The site would be inspected as part of the environmental review, with the fill limits, historical drainage connection, existing approvals, and construction records all subject to examination. She called me immediately. "Owen, are they talking about making us remove it?" I looked across the property at the new gazebo standing over the buried ditch. "That is what they are coming to decide." Daniel opened our presentation exactly the way we had planned. No speech about fairness. No accusation that the association had tried to steal anything. He simply placed my recorded deed on the table, and the faint rustle of paper seemed louder than every whisper in the courtroom. Then he did something Rebecca clearly had not expected. He acknowledged that the homeowners had acted in good faith. For nearly 30 years, brochures, welcome packets, fishing tournaments, summer picnics, and uninterrupted access had taught families to believe the lake was part of their community. Rebecca looked toward me for half a second. I understood the surprise in her face. We were not attacking their history. We were separating history from ownership. Daniel placed the chain of title behind the deed. Then the subdivision plat. Then the license survey showing the gravel entrance remained entirely inside my parcel. Each document landed with the same quiet weight. Rebecca's attorney stood and argued that hundreds of families had relied on decades of access when buying their homes. He never challenged my deed. He never challenged the survey. Instead, he asked the court to recognize what 30 years of reasonable expectation had created. Then, Rebecca testified. Her voice stayed steady as she explained that she had bought her own home, believing the association controlled access to the lake. Every board before hers had operated the same way. She admitted they had never possessed a recorded easement, but insisted the community had not invented its belief. That was when Daniel reached the document Rebecca's side had once believed might save them. The canceled transfer agenda. The room went still. The developer had intended to discuss transferring the lake. The meeting had been canceled after his medical emergency. Beside it, Daniel placed the unsigned attorney memorandum. Suddenly, the association's strongest argument became the clearest explanation for why everyone had been wrong. A transfer had been contemplated. It had simply never happened. Daniel finished with the handwritten gate key schedule, maintenance logs, and insurance records. Every private owner had received the keys. Every private owner had paid for dam inspections, repairs, and liability coverage. The association had organized recreation, but it had never carried the legal burdens attached to the property. Rebecca's attorney tried once more to return to decades of reliance. The judge leaned forward. His fingers rested on the canceled agenda beside my deed. "Can you identify the document where permission became a recorded property interest?" Nobody moved. I could hear the ventilation system humming above us. Rebecca's attorney looked down at his notes, then back at the judge. "No, Your Honor. There is no such document." The judge closed the evidence binder. He said he would review the complete record and issue a written decision. Then his hand stopped on the cover, and I realized every argument was over. Nothing else could be added. Nothing could be taken away. The facts were finally complete. All that remained was the answer. 3 days later, Daniel called while I was standing beside the same gravel entrance Rebecca had once treated like an association amenity. I could hear wind moving across the lake behind me. "The order is in," he said. I stopped walking. The court confirmed my ownership of the lake parcel and the access road. The association had no recorded easement, no ownership interest, and no authority to represent either property as an HOA-controlled amenity. The canceled transfer agenda proved only that a transfer had once been considered. The unsigned attorney memorandum proved it had never been completed. 30 years of neighborhood use had created expectations, but expectations were not a deed. The judge also rejected the association's attempt to turn organized recreation into ownership. The maintenance records mattered. The insurance records mattered. The gate key schedule mattered. Every private owner before me had carried the obligations Rebecca's board claimed came with ownership. The association had enjoyed access without carrying those burdens. That distinction ended the argument. The financial consequences were real, but proportional. The HOA had to stop advertising the lake as association property, correct its community materials, remove its claim of control over the entrance, and cover the costs assigned under the court's order. More importantly, the board could no longer charge residents for access it had never owned. Rebecca did not lose her house. Nobody was dragged away. She simply lost the authority she had tried to exercise over property that was never hers. At the next association meeting, the board formally withdrew its lake rules, and Rebecca stepped down as president. The same homeowners who had once looked at me like I was stealing their shoreline now understood what had actually happened. I could have closed the gate permanently. Legally, the road and lake were mine, but that was never why I fought. I offered residents a written recreational access agreement with clear hours, safety requirements, insurance terms, and one condition the old system had never respected: permission remained permission. It did not become ownership because enough years passed. The agreement was voluntary, documented, and revocable. No imaginary HOA authority. No misleading brochures. No more pretending. A week later, I stood beside that gate at sunrise with the court order folded inside my jacket. The old metal key felt cool against my palm. Months earlier, Rebecca had stood there, telling me I could not enter my own property. Now the association sign was gone. The records were corrected, my title was secure, and families were still able to enjoy the water because I had chosen cooperation instead of surrender. I unlocked the gate, listened to the chain slide free, and watched the morning light spread across my lake. Ownership did not need permission.